A breakthrough for scientists after they had a 20-minute conversation with a humpback whale.
Somewhere off the volcanic coast of a small Caribbean island, a hydrophone anchored to the seafloor picks up a burst of clicks. To a passerby, it would sound like nothing more than static, like a radio caught between stations. But inside a lab thousands of miles away, an algorithm flags the pattern instantly. It has seen this exact rhythm before. It knows which family made the sound, and it has a working theory about what it means. That algorithm did not learn this from a textbook. It learned it the same way a child learns a language, by listening over and over until the noise stopped being noise. For most of human history, the ocean kept its secrets. We built ships that could cross it, cities that could overlook it, and machines that could dive into its deepest trenches, yet the actual conversations happening beneath the waves stayed just out of reach. That changed, quietly and without much fanfare at first, when a team of scientists decided to stop treating whale sounds as background noise and start treating them as language. What they eventually found didn't just answer old questions about how whales talk to each other. It raised new ones about what language even means and about whether humans have been far too narrow in deciding who gets to have one. Before any of this became possible, whales were mostly known to us as shapes, enormous silhouettes gliding beneath boats, or carcasses hauled onto docks during the whaling era. For centuries, they were valued for their oil, their bone, and their size, not their minds. Sailors spun tall tales about sea monsters lurking in the deep, but the actual sounds whales made rarely factored into the story. It wasn't until the technology to listen underwater caught up with our curiosity that things started to shift. That shift arrived in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when researchers recording humpback whales in the open ocean noticed something odd. The moans, groans, and eerie cries they picked up on their equipment weren't random. They repeated. They built on themselves. They had structure, almost like verses in a song. A biologist named Roger Payne, working with these recordings, helped popularize the idea that whales were not just making noise but singing, in long, evolving compositions that could stretch on for the better part of an hour and change from year to year. When an album of these recordings was released to the public, it did something almost nobody expected. It made people fall in love with an animal they'd never seen up close. That wave of public affection is often credited as one of the sparks behind the global movement to end commercial whaling. But falling in love with a song is different from understanding a language. For decades after that breakthrough, marine biologists were stuck in roughly the same position. They could record whale sounds by the hour, but they had no reliable way to decode what any of it meant. Was a particular call a warning? A greeting? Something closer to a name? Every theory was plausible and none could be proven. The tools of the time, reel-to-reel tape, basic sonar, and the human ear, simply weren't built for the scale of pattern recognition the problem demanded. Understanding a language isn't just about capturing sound. It's about finding structure hidden inside thousands or millions of examples, and no human researcher, however dedicated, could listen to enough whale calls in a lifetime to reliably spot patterns that repeat only once every few thousand recordings. The breakthrough, when it finally came, didn't originate in a marine biology department. It came from a scientist who spent a lot of time thinking about a completely different kind of alien. Marine biologist and National Geographic explorer David Gruber had built a career studying strange and often overlooked corners of ocean life, from glowing sharks to sea turtles. But he became fixated on a much bigger question. If we ever did make contact with an intelligence that didn't think or communicate the way we do, would we even recognize it? That question led him toward the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the decades-long effort to scan the cosmos for signals from other civilizations. SETI's entire premise rests on a hard truth. We don't know what an alien message would sound like, so we have to build systems capable of finding structure in something completely unfamiliar. Gruber had a realization that sounds almost too simple in hindsight. We didn't need to wait for a signal from space to test that idea. We already had a species on our own planet whose inner world remained almost entirely unknown to us, despite living alongside humans for millions of years. Sperm whales have the largest brains of any animal that has ever lived on Earth, several times the size of a human brain, and they live in tight-knit family units with their own apparent customs and communication habits. If any earthly creature could serve as a testing ground for interpreting a truly alien mind, Gruber reasoned, it might be this one. Out of that idea came Project SETI, the Cetacean Translation Initiative, a name deliberately built to echo SETI. The goal was immodest. Gruber and his collaborators didn't just want to catalog a few dozen distinct whale calls, the way earlier research had. They wanted to reconstruct as completely as possible the actual grammar of sperm whale communication and eventually try to speak back. No single kind of expert could pull off something like this alone, and the team Gruber assembled reflected that. It brought together field biologists who had spent years, sometimes decades, in the water with whales, linguists trained in analyzing the structure of human languages, roboticists capable of building underwater recording equipment tough enough to survive months at sea, and machine learning specialists more accustomed to training systems on internet text than ocean audio. One of the most important people on that list was Shane Jarrow, a biologist who had already devoted more than a decade to studying a single population of sperm whales living near the island of Dominica. Jarrow didn't just study these whales from a distance. He got to know them, individual by individual, family by family, tracking births, deaths, and social bonds across multiple generations. That kind of long-term, on-the-water knowledge became the foundation the entire project was built on, because no algorithm, however sophisticated, can interpret a sound correctly without context about who made it, when and in what situation. Pairing that deep field knowledge with modern machine learning was the genuinely new part. Earlier attempts to study whale sound had access to hours or days of recordings. Project SETI, once it got going, was aiming for something orders of magnitude larger, a dataset big enough that a neural network could start finding patterns invisible to the human ear. Dominica turned out to be an almost perfect location for this kind of large-scale listening. Its coastline drops off into deep water almost immediately, which lets sperm whales come remarkably close to shore. The same resident families return to those waters year after year, giving researchers a stable, repeatable population to study rather than a constantly shifting one. The project launched formally in 2020, with a major funding boost from the TED Audacious project that gave the team the resources to build something that had never existed before, a dense underwater listening network stretching across a wide swath of ocean off Dominica's coast, designed to capture not just isolated calls, but entire conversations happening between multiple whales at once. Getting a whale to sit still for an interview was never going to work, so the team had to get creative about how they gathered data. The backbone of the system was a network of hydrophones, underwater microphones far more sensitive than anything used in earlier decades of whale research, anchored across the seafloor in a coordinated grid. Individually, a hydrophone just listens. But arranged in a network and running continuously, the array could do something no single microphone could: triangulate exactly where sound originated and therefore identify, with real precision, which whale in a group was doing the talking. That distinction turned out to matter enormously, because a click sequence made by a mother communicating with her calf carries completely different weight than the same sequence exchanged between two unrelated adults hunting in different directions. Sound alone wasn't enough, though. To understand why a whale was making a particular call, researchers needed to know what that whale was actually doing at the moment it clicked. That's where the robotics side of the project came in. Small, non-invasive suction cup tags, developed to fall away harmlessly after a set period, were attached to whales using specially designed drones, avoiding the need for a boat to get uncomfortably close. These tags recorded far more than sound. They tracked depth, movement, heart rate, and proximity to other whales, effectively giving researchers a behavioral diary to pair with every vocalization picked up by the hydrophone network. A click made while a whale was diving for food could now be distinguished from a click made while it was resting near family, and that context turned out to be essential. Within a few years, this combination of always-on hydrophones and tagged individuals had produced a dataset unlike anything that existed before it, not hours of whale sound, but millions of individual vocalizations, each one tagged with information about who made it, where, and under what circumstances. On its own, that dataset was still just an overwhelming pile of noise. The next step was figuring out how to make sense of it. Feeding raw audio into a computer and expecting it to spit out a dictionary was never realistic. The The first real task was translation of a different kind, converting sound into something visual. Researchers ran the recordings through processes that generate spectrograms, essentially images that map how sound frequency changes over time. Once whale calls existed as visual patterns rather than pure audio, they became something a machine learning model could actually analyze the way it might analyze any other image dataset. From there, deep learning models, the same broad category of technology behind modern image recognition and language systems, were set loose on the spectrograms with one goal: find the codas. A coda, in sperm whale terms, is a short, structured burst of clicks, typically 3 to 40 clicks that occur in quick succession and appear to function as the basic building block of communication, somewhat like a word or short phrase does for humans. Instead of being handed a list of rules, the models were trained on millions of labeled examples and left to discover regularities on their own, noticing which patterns tended to appear together, which rhythms showed up in specific social situations, and which sequences seemed to repeat across completely different whale families. What emerged from that process surprised even the researchers who had spent their careers listening to these animals. The clicks weren't just varying in number. They varied in rhythm, in tempo, and in something the team started calling ornamentation. Small extra clicks tacked onto the beginning or end of a coda that appeared to shift its meaning without changing its core identity. A coda delivered slowly might carry one implication. The same basic sequence, sped up or given an extra flourish at the end, appeared to carry another. Layered together, these variables, rhythm, tempo, ornamentation, and a subtle fine-grained timing shift the researchers compared to rubato in music, created something resembling a phonetic system, not letters exactly, but a set of adjustable building blocks that could combine in an enormous number of ways to produce distinct, repeatable units of meaning. This was the moment the project moved from interesting animal behavior to something that genuinely resembled the architecture of language. Sperm whales, it turned out, were not simply repeating a small handful of fixed signals. They were combining a limited set of components in flexible, contextual ways, which is, at its core, exactly what human language does too. The deeper the analysis went, the more the picture shifted away from simple survival signaling and toward something far more social. Researchers had long assumed that if whales were communicating anything structured, it would likely be basic and functional, warnings about predators, calls related to feeding, maybe something tied to mating. What the models actually found leaned much more heavily toward identity and relationship. Different whale clans, it turned out, used noticeably different dialects. Two families living in overlapping waters might use similar core codas, but apply distinct rhythmic or ornamental variations to them, the acoustic equivalent of a regional accent. The model could tell, purely from the pattern of clicks, which family group was speaking, long before any human researcher could confirm it by sight. That finding reframed the whole project. This wasn't a single universal code shared identically by every sperm whale on Earth. It was something closer to a living cultural inheritance, passed down within family lines and subtly reshaped over generations, much the way human dialects and slang shift between regions and eras without ever losing mutual intelligibility. That discovery also forced a reconsideration of what these communications were actually for. Rather than functioning primarily as survival tools, the patterns suggested a communication system deeply tied to social bonding, reinforcing family identity, maintaining group cohesion, and possibly even conveying something like individual recognition, similar to how humans use names. It's a very different picture than the one most people carried in their heads, of whales as simply loud, mysterious creatures making noise in the dark. Instead, the data pointed toward tight social units with their own dialects, their own histories, and communication that served relationships as much as it served survival. Cracking the structure of a language is one thing. Using it to actually say something is another challenge entirely, and it's the phase Project SETI is now cautiously stepping into. Rather than trying to teach whales anything resembling English, researchers are working in the opposite direction, using the patterns the models discovered to construct and play back genuine whale-style codas, essentially attempting the earliest, most basic forms of two-way exchange. Think less, translate a sentence, and more, test whether a specific, structured signal produces a specific, structured response. That approach already produced a moment the team considers a milestone. In 2023, researchers played a recorded sperm whale coda through an underwater speaker near a wild whale in the area. Rather than ignoring it or reacting with alarm, the whale responded with what appeared to be the same coda back, an exchange that looked, for all practical purposes, like the opening seconds of a conversation. It wasn't a full dialogue, and nobody involved is claiming otherwise, but it was a genuine back and forth built on a pattern the AI had identified rather than one guessed at by a human ear. For a project built on the premise that whale communication has real, learnable structure, that kind of responsive exchange was exactly the kind of validation researchers had been chasing. None of this is moving forward without serious internal debate. Introducing human-generated signals into a wild population's communication system is not a small decision, and the team has been notably cautious about it. There are real concerns about disrupting natural social dynamics, about the ethics of speaking to another species without fully understanding the consequences, and about the risk of contaminating a language that has evolved undisturbed for millions of years. The stated goal isn't to impose a human framework onto whales, but to let any future dialogue happen on terms shaped by what the whales themselves are already doing, using their patterns, their rhythms, their existing vocabulary, rather than inventing something artificial and hoping it translates. The implications of this work stretch well past marine biology, and that's not an exaggeration for effect. For as long as animal behavior has been studied scientifically, researchers have been limited by observation, watching what an animal does, and inferring meaning from the outside. Being able to actually parse structured communication changes that relationship fundamentally. It shifts the question from what is this animal doing to what is this animal saying, and those are very different kinds of knowledge. There's also the deliberate echo built into the project's own name. By modeling their methods on SETI, the Project SETI team essentially built a working answer to a question that used to live purely in science fiction. How would we even begin decoding a message from an intelligence that doesn't communicate anything like we do? The pattern recognition techniques developed to separate a meaningful sperm whale coda from ocean noise are, in a very real sense, rehearsal for a scenario involving a signal from somewhere much farther away. If humanity ever does receive something from beyond Earth, the tools built to understand whales may end up being part of how we try to make sense of it. And then there's the more grounded, immediate consequence, the one that doesn't require imagining aliens at all. Sperm whales have spent centuries being defined by what they could provide to humans: oil, bone, and later, simple curiosity from a safe distance. Discovering that they maintain distinct family dialects, apparently coordinate socially through structured communication, and pass cultural patterns down across generations makes it considerably harder to think of them as simple animals reacting instinctively to their environment. It reframes them as beings with something that looks a great deal like culture, identity, and relationship.